We have a pretty big story coming out of Elizabeth City, North Carolina, as of a couple of days ago. And there is a $3 million settlement that was reached from Pasquotank County, North Carolina, the county that murdered Andrew Brown Jr. on April 21st, 2021. They have settled. I believe there was a federal lawsuit or some kind for $30 million. They settled for $3 million. And I want to read this story. So, this is in the New York Times. The reason why I wanted to read this in the New York Times is because I'm interested in what national media has to say. A North Carolina sheriff's office said this week that a $3 million settlement agreement had been reached with the family of Andrew Brown Jr., an unarmed black man who was shot and killed in his car last year by deputies executing a search and arrest warrants. So real quick, we already have some not correct information. They did not have an arrest warrant when they did this. They claimed to have had an arrest warrant. And then people looked up the warrant, found out there was no warrant. They just had a search warrant. So, I believe they tried to file for an arrest warrant, but it wasn't properly processed at the time or something like that. The settlement, which the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office announced on Monday, brings to a close a year of litigation by members of Mr. Brown's family who sued the sheriff, Tommy Wooten II, and 3 deputies over the fatal shooting in Elizabeth City, North Carolina on April 21st, 2021. At a news conference on Tuesday, lawyers representing Mr. Brown's relatives said the settlement was a step toward healing. The settlement was designed to make sure Andrew Brown's children were taken care of, Harry Daniels, one of the family's lawyers, said. It does that for years to come. He said that Mr. Brown, who was 42, had 7 children, 2 of whom are now adults. In a brief statement at the news conference, Sheriff Wooten said, his department has severely advanced our training since Mr. Brown's death, with an emphasis on de-escalation techniques. I just want to say that that is not true. What they did, now again, for those of you that don't know, I used to live in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. I participated in hundreds of days of demonstrations about this story, and I followed it very closely. And that is not true. What they did was they basically spent a bunch of money on like a rebrand to have a bunch of people go in there and like tell them a couple things, and that's it. They didn't really do any. They just didn't severely advance their training. That's a lie. Like, it's just they brought in an outside group. They renamed themselves peace officers, like out of 1984. They did a couple of drills, and then they got a certificate that says, we've completed advanced training. They didn't do severely advanced training. That's a lie. They made it up. And they also, again, did not emphasize de-escalation techniques. This is all made up. This is cop speak. Don't trust anything that they say. The settlement agreement has not been released to the public. The defendants have denied liability, Chris Geese, a lawyer for Sheriff Wooten, said. So let me get this straight. So they settled, but they're claiming they didn't do anything wrong? Well, if you didn't do anything wrong, why are you settling, right? But again, this is how cops work. They lie all the time. Under the agreement, Mr. Brown's estate will dismiss all claims against the defendants, in addition to any other potential claims arising from Mr. Brown's death, according to a statement issued by the Sheriff's Office. On the morning of April 21, 2021, 3 Pasquotank County Sheriff deputies dressed in tactical gear arrived at Mr. Brown's house in Elizabeth City to execute drug-related search and arrest warrants. Again, that's not correct information. There's also 3 deputies is also not correct information. There were 7 deputies. 3 of them shot Andrew Brown Jr., but there were 7 deputies total. So, New York Times has got quite a bit of misinformation here. And this is why, again, I wanted to read an article from mainstream media, because I am very familiar with this case, and so I'm just curious what the media gets right and gets wrong. And again, it's very important to understand how mainstream media, they're not talking to community leaders in Elizabeth City to get this story. They're just reporting what the sheriff said. That's it. They're like taking a note from the lawyer for Andrew Brown's family, and then taking notes from the sheriff, and then like kind of like just looking up a couple things on Google and then just throwing it into an article. This is a really poorly researched article. Again, there were 7 deputies, not 3. But 3 did shoot but there were 7 total. Mr. Brown was sitting in a parked car in his driveway and refused to get out of the vehicle. When he attempted to drive away, the deputies fired at him more than a dozen times, according to court documents. 5 bullets struck Mr. Brown, who died of a gunshot wound to his head. He was shot in the back of the head. Another important detail of this story is that when the 7 sheriff's deputies cornered Andrew Brown Jr. and attempted to kill him, and when 3 of them fired with their AR-15s, stray bullets, went into a neighbor's home and nearly killed a random person in the neighborhood. Another important detail is that this is all happening in a school zone around 8 in the morning. So this is in a school zone early in the morning, and the 3 deputies who shot ended up shooting into a neighbor's house, nearly killing a random neighbor. Now, again, the bullet went into this neighbor's house, through several walls, and into their kitchen. So let's assume the neighbor got up a little bit earlier or got up a little bit later and was in the kitchen making coffee. They would be dead. I'm just saying, this is something the mainstream media has just completely ignored about this case. Who died of a gunshot wound to his head, according to a private autopsy paid for by his family. Mr. Geese, the lawyer for the sheriff's office, said on Tuesday that an investigation by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation has determined that Mr. Brown was not armed at the time. Oh, you don't say? Mr. Brown's estate has initially sought damages of $30 million in his federal civil rights lawsuit, which was filed in the Eastern District of North Carolina. A New York Times analysis of slowed-down body camera footage of the shooting showed that 13 of the 14 gunshots, including the fatal one, were fired as Mr. Brown was driving away from the officers, not at them. Mr. Brown's family and their lawyers called his death an execution. The deputies were not charged. Andrew Womble, the district attorney for North Carolina's 1st Judicial District, determined that the deputies were justified in their actions because Mr. Brown was using his car as a, quote, deadly weapon. Now, there's a lot of corruption with Andrew Womble, the district attorney, and the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Department. There's a lot of corruption. There's been many, many, many examples of corruption over the course of their relationship together. One of the core things that should be noted is that the district attorney's office is inside of the sheriff department building. So every day that he goes to his office, he sees all of these sheriffs, and he talks to them all. They're all buddies. Like, if that's not a conflict of interest to you, I got a bridge to fucking sell you. The $3 million settlement to be paid by the county and its insurance company will be shared by Mr. Brown's children, according to the statement from the sheriff's office. Mr. Brown was a devoted father who wanted his children to have the things he didn't, his family's lawyer said in a statement. While no settlement could ever fill the hole his death left in their hearts, the agreement is about providing for those children's futures, securing their education, and ensuring their dreams didn't die with their father, the lawyer said. Mr. Brown's death, one day after a jury found a former Minneapolis police officer guilty of murder in the death of George Floyd, brought renewed scrutiny to police violence against black people. In Elizabeth City, a majority black city with a population of around 18,000 people, people protested in the streets and expressed frustration about the state's policy that only a judge can authorize the release of body camera footage. Elizabeth City and Pasquotank County established curfews in the days after Mr. Brown's shooting. Once again, I participated in these demonstrations. There were daily demonstrations for approximately, I believe it was like well over a year. And I participated in the demonstrations for about 260 days or something. I don't remember the exact number. But it needs to be said that the curfew that was established by the mayor of Elizabeth City, who claimed to feel the pain of the community. And then she called a curfew and brought in, I believe that they spent well over $1 million bringing in riot police from all across the state of North Carolina. What they issued was an announcement to the entire state of North Carolina. Any officer in the entire state of North Carolina could go to Elizabeth City, put on riot gear, and beat the shit out of black people for fun. And so when I was there in Elizabeth City participating in these demonstrations, we saw, police cars from counties of North Carolina that were 200 plus miles away on the opposite side of the state. Elizabeth City is by the coast. It's right by the water. And so, on the opposite side of the state, there were county sheriffs and other sorts of local police departments that drove several hundred miles just to put on riot gear and, threaten to beat the shit out of black people. A lot of people got hurt during this protest. A lot of people were falsely arrested. A lot of people were charged with fake crimes, myself included. Right? So it's interesting that they're not going to talk about that part. The FBI announced in the days after the shooting that its field office in Charlotte, North Carolina would conduct a civil rights investigation to determine whether the sheriff's deputies had violated any federal laws. The Bureau said in a statement on Tuesday that the investigation remained open. So, this is overall, I'm glad that mainstream media is talking about it. That's great. But this is not that great of an article. And again, the reason why I wanted to talk about this with a New York Times article is because it's important to understand that media, especially national media, when we're reading any national news story about anything that happens in some area, right? National media, it's like a game of telephone, right? The local media, typically underfunded, or if they are funded, they're funded by billionaires. There's one media company in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. The newspaper is the Daily Advance. It's owned by a Tennessee billionaire who just owns a bunch of small local papers. And so there's other, regional media, like, in the Virginia Beach area, which Elizabeth City, North Carolina is close to. It's right on the border. And so there's a couple of regional media, again, all bought and paid for by corporations, right? And so local media doesn't really do a good job reporting this stuff. And national media basically just sees what the local media does with its underfunded, or if it is funded in the wrong direction, copies their notes. And it turns out the national media they just drop a bunch of information throughout the whole process. And so every time you do read any of these national stories, you need to understand that there's so many details that are being left out all the time. And so in this example, I lived in Elizabeth City, North Carolina when this happened. I participated in multiple hundred days of protest demonstrations, right? I paid very close attention to what the police were doing. I, got charged with false bullshit to throw me into the court system. And again, I did not they dropped the charges because their case was so horrible. But again, I got footage of all of this. You could go check out all the footage of this whole thing from last year. One of these days I'll upload more of that footage because there's a shitload. But, I got to go through it and make sure that, when I'm uploading doesn't contain private information. But again, every time you do read a national story, especially when it comes to police and people police murdering random civilians, you have to understand what you are reading. If you are not in that town, if you are not in that city, what you are reading has gone through several degrees of the game telephone, where people drop information and add new details and erase certain parts of it. And so you're never going to get a complete story unless you talk to people that are on the ground. And that is why local reporters and local media is so important, right? There were a couple of people, myself included, that did take the time to document a lot of the crimes that the police were committing on the civilians of Elizabeth City after the shooting. And it also needs to be said that after Andrew Brown Jr. was murdered, there were zero examples of any violence, any rioting or looting, and they still spent $1 million bussing in several police, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of police from all across the state. I remember during these curfew nights, there were riot police and buses, like literally like prison buses full of riot police and tear gas, just literally roaming the city. I remember trying to run home. I remember hiding in bushes because these people were searching for people to arrest. And a lot of the times, they arrested random people that were just walking around. Oh, there's a curfew, don't you know? When there's a curfew, that's an excuse for police to just fuck people up for fun. And again, another detail that needs to be understood is that the Elizabeth City Police Department, which is separate from the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Department, the Elizabeth City Police Department ensured that there would be safety for protest demonstrations. After the curfew nights, they ensured that the protesters would be safe. And they made a deal that, if the protesters gave their routes for protesting, that they would protect them from crazy people. They didn't do their job. Several people got run over by cars. The police, the Elizabeth City police, basically just let a bunch of violence happen and then clean it up afterward. And then it also needs to be said that the Elizabeth City police chief, Eddie Buffalo, was promoted to the public defense secretary of North Carolina by the Democratic governor, Roy Cooper. I remember Roy Cooper was called into Elizabeth City, and I met Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, after the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Department pinned a bunch of false charges on a bunch of people, myself included. Roy Cooper came to ensure us that we would be safe if we protested in Elizabeth City. He was on the job, as well as Attorney General Josh Stein. They were on the job. They were watching out for us. And if anything bad happened, we could give them a call. Well, a lot of bad things did happen. They never picked up the phone, and they just promoted the guy who was responsible for most of the bad stuff. So this is what happens. Yes, the Democratic governor of North Carolina is garbage. And again, it needs to be understood that the whole system is set up to ensure the protection of the police, to ensure the protection of the state, and they don't give a fuck about the citizenry. They don't give a fuck about the civilians. They don't give a flying fuck, a swimming fuck, or any other sort of adjective you want to attach to fuck. They don't care. They will pretend to care for the cameras. When the cameras are there, they're going to boo-hoo, oh, we're going to do our best. But when push comes to shove, as soon as people stop paying attention, they will immediately switch to another, they will just promote the guys responsible for all the problems, and they will use all their power to protect those that actually committed crimes. And so, again, you're not going to get that in a mainstream media article, in the same way that you're not going to get a lot of information that comes out of Minneapolis after George Floyd was murdered from national media, right? You need to support local media on the ground. Now, again, I don't live in Elizabeth City anymore, so, I can't tell you what happened after I moved out other than what I'm reading and from talking to people that live there. But again, it needs to be understood that every time you read national media, there's going to be multiple layers of context that are removed from these stories. And oftentimes, the layers removed are beneficial to the state, beneficial to the police. Because again, this article could have pointed out, they brought up the curfew. They could have pointed out that they bust in riot police from 250 miles away across the state, spent millions of dollars beating the shit out of elderly black people for fun and entertainment. They could say that, but they're not going to. Because they don't care. Doesn't matter to them. So, but anyway, I'm glad that there is something going on that's positive. And again, why would they settle if they're not claiming any responsibility for the shooting? Oh yeah, we didn't kill him. We're innocent. But here's a bunch of money, by the way, and don't sue us anymore. That's not how that works. When you settle, that's acknowledgement of guilt. So when they say, we're not guilty, haha, after settling, you know that that's bullshit, but of course they're going to say that because they're cops, and cops lie all the time. That's the role of police in this country, is to lie every step of the way.